Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. My name is Serena Longo, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore and N+1, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this evening's program with City by City co-editor Stephen Squibb and contributors Greg Afenagenev, Dan Albert, and Annie Wyman. Now, I'm very pleased to turn you over to Stephen Squibb, co-editor of City by City.
Thank you all so much for coming. It's so great to see a crowd like this here in June. But so the idea for City by City was sort of me and Keith, the co-editor, who just had a baby, which is one of the reasons he can't be here. But we both sort of had the idea independently of each other because of this incredible essay, which is in the book about Miami, that was written by a friend of ours named Emily Witt. And she'd sort of given us access to the real estate crisis in Miami by keeping a diary of all the real estate parties she'd gone to over the course of 2 years. So they sort of, you see them go from these kind of incredible decadent things to these like really small, impoverished little parties, and this way sort of told the story of the real estate boom and bust in Miami. And we were so enchanted with how this led us into such what would have been sort of like an abstract concept of like what is a financial crisis, and we heard all about it in terms of banks and the view from Manhattan, and we really loved the way that she got us this sort of different view. So we said, why not make a whole book about cities that sort of dealt with this time period and approached this issue from these different sort of smaller locations. So 37 essays later, and 5 years, we have City by City, and the book runs sort of from coast to coast, from San Diego to Syracuse. And the basic emphasis is on what life has been like in these cities over the past 5 to 10 years. So I think with that, I'll turn you over to Greg, who's going to tell you about Milwaukee.
So the rise of Scott Walker in Wisconsin, and I think now in national politics, unfortunately, has drawn inevitable comparisons to the Gilded Age. And so the story I want to start telling here, the rest you'll have to see in the book, is about what happened after the real Gilded Age in Milwaukee, and why in some ways it's both the cause and the solution for some of our most pressing quandaries. So in Wisconsin, the Gilded Age was represented above all by one man, Milwaukee Mayor David S. Rose, who came to power in 1898. Rose's corruption, lavish lifestyle, and kowtowing to municipal utility magnates were legendary, and the most lasting legacy of his administration was a massive bribery scandal involving streetcar contracts. His reign was punctuated by the 2-year stint by Sherburne Becker, boy mayor of Milwaukee, best known for his flashy cars and pink Becker hat. It was hard not to draw the conclusion that these men set the limits for Milwaukee politics in the early 20th century. But in the 1910 election, this conclusion would soon be severely tested. Milwaukee socialists, many of whom were German-speaking industrial workers, had gradually increased their share of the vote as the city industrialized and modernized in the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century. Although they subscribed in principle to the goal of international social revolution, under the leadership of Victor Berger, who became the first socialist congressman in 1911, they became firmly entrenched in electoral politics. In fact, they outdid their competitors with an army of bundle brigades who distributed campaign literature, and as well as a network of well-organized locals and branches, and as such, they were a forebear of the Obama campaign in some ways. And as socialists, of course, they stood for the rights of workers and the 8-hour day, but as it soon turned out, other aspects of their platform would prove more decisive. In Milwaukee, a city riven by official corruption and dominated by leading industrialists, the Socialist Party above all stood for clean, honest, and efficient government. In early 20th century America, even before the Bolshevik Revolution, no party calling itself socialist could be allowed to escape the connotations unscathed. A 1910 Republican campaign ad declared that Victor Berger promises, if his international party gains control, a bloody revolution. Victory for the socialists means a conflict with the red flag of bloodlust, borne by such men as Berger. The time to kill the serpent of socialism is now. Tomorrow may be too late. Middle-class voters were unimpressed with the charge that the many-headed reptile of socialism was more threatening than traditional politics, and swept Mayor Emil Seidel, along with a broad slate of other socialist candidates, into municipal office. They were proved right. Once in power, the socialists neither organized the working class for revolution, nor even threatened the Catholic Church, although Victor Berger did make some loud anti-clerical noises. It's true that the Milwaukee police, unlike that of almost any other municipality, were ordered to protect striking workers instead of shooting them. For the most part, however, the city's new masters showed that they deserved their derisive new nickname, sewer socialists. They cleaned up public utilities, established vocational schools, expanded the park system, and they succeeded in cleaning up city government too. So well, in fact, that they would likely have made further gains in the election of 1912 had the Democrats and Republicans not realized the precariousness of their position and joined forces against them. The nonpartisan reign proved equally short-lived. 4 years later, the socialist city attorney Dan Hone became mayor, a position that he was to occupy for the next 24 years. The paradox of Hone's mayoralty, I don't even know how to pronounce that word, was his enormous popularity and influence in a city which had begun to turn against the socialists. As the United States entered World War I in 1917, support for the Socialist Party collapsed. Not only were many of the socialists proud Germans, but they supported a platform of pacifism and internationalism, which was no longer acceptable in the jingoistic climate of the period. Victor Berger's Milwaukee Leader was one of the first publications in the US to be targeted for suppression under the new Espionage Act, and Berger ran his second campaign for Congress out of federal prison. He was popular enough among Milwaukee's voters that he was reelected, and then reelected again after Congress refused to seat him in 1919. The Supreme Court eventually overturned the verdict against him, and he served in Congress from 1923 to 1929. Other socialist politicians were less lucky, and Hone never had the luxury of a city council majority to support his decision. By the end of his last term, not a single socialist remained on the city council. As a result, Hone and the rest of the socialists focused again on what they did best, run a clean, efficient municipal government with a focus on public amenities and utilities. Everything Hone did for the city, he saw in terms of helping the workers in whose name he governed. Whether the worker be he who earns his livelihood by the sweat of his brow, or a teacher in the public schools, or as a small merchant, or a member of the so-called white-collared class, he is very vitally and actively interested in clean government, he announced in a rather self-congratulatory book called City Government. Workers are necessarily interested in ideal health conditions in the city. They cannot live in suburbs. All workers are interested in maintaining high standards in public school education. Workers are interested in parks and playgrounds, the health building and character building centers of the city. The Socialist platform in 1932 was the same sort of mishmash of left-wing rhetoric and centrist practice, in which the transition to a more humane system entailed a tax credit for low-income homeowners. But depressed Tea Party-era progressives, tempted to find in Hone a figure of nostalgia, would be alarmed to learn that municipal debt was one of his principal targets. A policy of extravagant borrowing, he insisted, is the ruin of the entire municipal structure. He considered the hard but sound road by which the city conserved and marshaled its finances to finally free itself from debt in 1933 to be one of his greatest successors. A struggle that he framed in his characteristic rhetorical manner as a battle against the bankers and the industrialists, who were not inclined to favor a pay-as-you-go policy. Hone's attempt to run the city on a cash basis was not a historical accident or a vagary of the political context. The point of socialist rule in Milwaukee, and the essence of its appeal, was that it could deliver better government and better services for less money. The consequence was a tightly wound and precisely balanced fiscal machine that performed well even as the city was devastated by Prohibition, which drove its famous breweries out of business, and the Great Depression. Hone's apparatus could deal with these crises even when, as between 1940 and 1948, this was not run by a socialist. Milwaukee had been an industrial metropolis since the last third of the 19th century. It was no stranger to busts and depressions. Industries had no choice but to rebuild, and when they rebuilt, they inevitably brought fresh waves of immigrants, jobs, and capital investment to the city. In short, for all of Hone's claims to the contrary, the large durable goods manufacturers that employed the lion's share of Milwaukee workers were just as invested as he was in good government. Because good government and ample city services kept the workforce growing and content, and the city's financial situation made it an excellent credit risk. World War II promised a return to lasting prosperity for the first time since Prohibition. The enormous demand for machine tools and other durable goods produced by Milwaukee employers brought with it renewed employment needs, and with European immigration shrinking drastically, the need for a new population of workers to fill them. The ideal candidates turned out to be blacks, both independent migrants and recruits brought to the city from the Deep South by industrial recruiting agents. Although Milwaukee had black citizens and black neighborhoods before this, they were not numerically significant until the 1940s. Even then, earlier clashes between unionized workers and black strikebreakers had shown how much industry could benefit from exploiting this population deprived of access to unions. Blacks would work for less money and in worse conditions than any of Milwaukee's existing social groups. It helped, too, that they could be more easily fired and replaced. In Milwaukee, as in other large northern cities, it was this initial confrontation between, on the one side, the white working class and organized labor, which had fought so successfully for better working conditions, and then on the other, black migrants who wanted the opportunities that only industrial work could bring, that launched the still unresolved struggle for civil rights. At the same time, there was little reason to doubt that as long as the alliance between industry, labor, and city government could be preserved, the pattern long established in Milwaukee and made efficient and streamlined by socialists could not fail completely. It would lead one wave of immigrants after another from menial, unskilled labor to low-skill, well-remunerated union jobs and their children into colleges and white-collar careers. Fueled by industrial development, the rising tide really would lift all boats, and the city would remain a sterling exemplar of efficient and provident government. What Hone and his successors could not have known was that this period of industrial recovery that accompanied World War II would be the city's last. After the war, during the still relatively placid tenure of the socialist Frank Zeidler, it gradually became clear that the city was changing. Predictably enough, or so it seems in retrospect, the workers who were so necessary to industrial growth in wartime were easy to discard after the need for tanks and airplanes disappeared. The ranks of unemployed and underpaid black migrants began to establish themselves in what was now called the inner core of the city, north and west of the bend in the Milwaukee River. As black neighborhoods grew, they inherited increasingly dilapidated housing stock from whites. These were the skilled workers, craftsmen, and foremen who had formed the core of the socialist voting bloc, the same people whom Hone had believed could not live in suburbs. Of course, when they got the chance, they showed with their feet that they could live in suburbs just fine. Independent of the city, with low taxes and ironclad closed housing codes, the wealthy ring of suburbs around Milwaukee expanded in both population and political power, and the people who filled them no longer had any interest in Milwaukee city government. Demographically, too, the white population of the city had less and less in common with the blacks who replaced them. The children of socialist factory operatives were Republican and centrist Democrat white-collar workers and professionals. And then for the rest of the story, you'll have to see the book. Thank you.
I realized I totally forgot to introduce Greg. Greg is actually a PhD candidate here at Harvard, and he's writing a dissertation on Russian spies in China in the 18th century. I will now, as a sort of interlude, read a very short piece, one of my favorites, about Phoenix. One of the challenges with this project was to try to sort of balance out sort of more scholarly accounts with more sort of idiosyncratic or personal ones, and also to figure out how, because so much of the experience of American cities over the past 2 decades or really half a century has been so similar, which city was the sort of best way to tell which story. And Greg's piece about Milwaukee is a great example because it tells a story about white flight. This is about Phoenix, and it's by Emily Gokolak. I grew up in Phoenix in what they call a ranch-style house. The low, flat, very slightly sloped roof, the big lawn dotted with lazy eucalyptus and palm trees. But the name was misleading because it was never a ranch. It was built on an old grove. The whole neighborhood used to be citrus. My parents bought it when they moved to Phoenix from New York City in 1986. They didn't want to raise my sister in the city. Arizona is cheaper and more temperate. My mother refused suburban Connecticut. My dad refused anywhere my mother had family. They bought a house and gutted it and stuccoed it and painted the stucco very pale pink and roofed it with white tiles that are the same white tiles used to roof houses in Bermuda. They kept the palm trees and a few eucalyptuses, put in some olive trees and several big ficus. They planted what would become a giant grapefruit tree at the back of the lot. Ruby red, it blossomed in the wintertime, when its trunk was painted paper white for protection from the sun. Sunscreen for citrus trees, they were all painted white. This is only necessary until the canopy is thick enough to shade the trunk, but people kept painting trees anyway because they liked the way it looks. Just visible from the corner of our lot over the hedge of oleanders was Camelback Mountain in the middle of Phoenix. Everything spreads out from there into the low downtown and then in all directions to the suburbs. We lived near the center of the city, but the streets and lawns and buildings were as lazy and low and open as any suburb. If you climb to the top of Camelback, which is very steep, you see a lot of green from golf courses and lawns and some taller buildings to the west, but not a lot. On the other side of the mountain, the city stays small and stops when cotton and melon fields begin in chunks to the east. Then to the south, the city starts up again, close to the ground. The sound of helicopters in my backyard meant someone had climbed the mountain and gotten stuck. One afternoon, a few days before Halloween, I climbed into my treehouse to practice batting my eyelashes. The air smelled as fall does in Phoenix, like grass wet from the sprinklers after searing summer. When my eyes stopped fluttering, I saw 2 men and a woman talking in the empty lot behind us, too far to overhear. When the woman walked away, I noticed she had long red hair. Then one of the men started pacing, and the other hit him in the face, then the stomach, then the face again. The pacing man now lay motionless in the dusty dirt, while the other man walked across the lot where the woman waited in a gray sedan. He got in and drove off. The fallen man started moving slowly. I did nothing, then ran inside, where I told no one and resumed batting my eyelashes. Years later, my parents said they wanted to get out before all the other roofs grew higher and our house's value sunk, before we were towered over. They sold for more than they'd hoped to people who seemed nice enough. They were extremely short. Several years passed, and I went for a jog by the house. Its top and front were stripped. When I got home, I asked my dad what was going on. "They're making a fake second story," he said, but I didn't understand. He explained that the house was not constructed in a manner that could support a second story structurally, so the new owners were adding a second story that made the house look taller, but it was just for the facade. It was a non-functional second story. You'd walk inside the front door and look up and see the same ceiling you saw before, but now it had the appearance of a place with 2 stories. Our new house was 2 miles away on a street called Casablanca. It didn't have palm trees or citrus groves, although we planted a hedge of ornamental oranges on the perimeter. They'd grow tall, but their fruit was bitter and inedible. We didn't know the neighbors, really. Then one night, 3 doors down, some construction caught fire, and they were there, the neighbors, out on the street. My dad and I speculated that it was one of the arsonists who did it, high on torching properties believed to be encroaching on precious desert land. One of our preservationist arsonists. But this made no sense because we were in the middle of the city, on land that hadn't been desert in decades. In 2011, armed men broke into a house 5 minutes away and tied up the couple living there after making them empty their safe at gunpoint. Apparently they were major art and jewelry collectors with a not insignificant security operation, and it was an inside job. Nobody got hurt. A few months after that, an elderly couple came home from the opera and found an intruder in their home. They were tied up and shot in the head and were beyond recognition by the time the flames went out. The police believe one man acted alone and gave away stolen prescription drugs and jewelry to his friends. This second fire was too far for us to witness, but the first one was close. I remember the neighbors talking while the vacant house burned. After that, I drove to see our old house with its fake second floor. I wore sunglasses and tucked my hair under a sweat-stained baseball cap in order to look unrecognizable. My dog slobbered on the window. It felt like trespassing. I saw a very short woman walk out and go for the mail. Her hair was short and straight and tidy and blonde. She looked at my car, and I drove until nothing was familiar, until I wasn't where I was from anymore. It felt good. So our next reader is Dan Albert. Dan just actually signed a book deal with Norton for a book called Are We There Yet? Cars, Robots, and the Future of Driving. And he's going to talk about the relationship of the highway to the city.
Book's selling so hot, we only have the 1 copy. 2 copies. Sorry. Now you've lost my page. Here we go. Thank you all for coming here. Most of the time I just attach things to emails and they disappear, and I never hear about them again. So it's great to be able to read in front of some people. This is different than most of the essays. It's not about a city. Keith, the other editor, asked me to write something about highways and the relationship between the highways and the cities, because so much of the material in here ended up talking about roads. So we cannot know how New York would be different had the highways never been built or had the plans left on the drawing board been realized. Jane Jacobs and others stopped the Moses Plan for a lower Manhattan expressway that would have obliterated Soho. But would they be happy that the neighborhoods, including Jacobs' beloved Greenwich Village, have become enclaves for the super rich? The modern city rests on a web of technologies, including sanitary sewers, distributed electricity, safe water supplies, steel frame construction, and mechanized transport. Without these, cities would stretch no more than a few miles across, or about the distance a person can walk in an hour. They could be neither the teeming home to the diverse millions that are their purpose, nor claim the prize as the most environmentally friendly living arrangements for those millions. Each of these technologies, all of this infrastructure, arose to solve urban problems. So it was, too, with the urban freeways, intended not to destroy the city, but to save it. It's easy to romanticize the city of your youth or the storied one of your grandparents' youth. I know New York always drew me in as a connection to my mother and my uncle and my grandparents, and hats and pipe cleaners and lace cookies with the white boxes and the red and white string that came from the silver orbs above the counter. But my Bronx-born mother always told us kids she was from Yonkers, though she only moved there at the age of 16. She never talked much about her time as a social worker in Harlem. She loves her house in the suburbs. In other words, if Robert Moses destroyed New York City to build the suburbs, Mom and millions like her were right behind him. Today, the worst aspects of the highway in the city are being confronted. Boston buried its central artery, never a central vein, at a cost of over $1 billion a mile. New Orleans seems set to tear down its elevated Claiborne Expressway. Tunneling has become so much less expensive and cumbersome that urban freeways are becoming interred, and the public will celebrate, as they did when Seattle brought in Bertha, the world's largest tunneling machine, to worm a new route under the viaduct. Bertha actually got stuck. I don't know if you follow this, but then they had to pull her up, and they're going to put her back in, so people are, well, it's Seattle, so people aren't that upset, because, a new route under the viaduct. Could the Cross Bronx and the Bruckner be far behind? Technology is also making public transport more viable and less expensive, from Zipcar to ride-sharing apps to intelligent transport infrastructure and driverless buses. The line between public and private transportation might one day be pretty blurry. We might trade owning cars for buying transportation services provided by individual autonomous vehicles. The transportation problem, the problem of moving about, will remain. Dodge Street through Omaha may be riddled with strip malls and parking lots, a depressing realm. But a few minutes west, it becomes Dodge Road, a grade-separated highway with city boulevards flying over it every mile as if it were part of Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City. Dodge is also part of Route 6, dedicated to the Union Army as the Grand Army of the Republic Highway. It's one of the longest roads in the country and the one that Jack Kerouac first set out on when he went on the road. For Kerouac, the road served as the antipode to consumerism and the American military might he saw on display in the nation's capital. Oddly, the interstates have destroyed Kerouac's road as surely as they have the city. The road trip on the old two-lane highways was a journey of serendipity, whimsy, and the chance to see something new. It does not exist on the interstate, whose culture of hurtling speed, punctuated by rest stops, served by national chains, provides a comforting conformity. The interstate highway is very much part and parcel of the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower himself warned of as he left office. The interstate's the ultimate closed road. But whereas the plan had always been for the superhighways to supplant the dangerous and unruly Route 6 and Route 66, they were supposed to have saved the city. Interring the urban freeways may not reverse the urban agenda that created them in the first place. Some would call it a plan to revitalize the city, others a plan to separate white from black, rich from poor. If the land freed up by burying the roads simply opens up more land for high-priced development, or as in Boston, for urban amenities to serve a high-value customer, it will only continue a process begun by the first horse cars. As Bloomberg said, New York is a luxury product, and he's a billionaire enemy of cars. Just as a highway could not save us from the streetcar suburban development, nor resolve the socioeconomic conflicts of mid-century America, transportation policy alone cannot transform America into the city that we all seem to want. The interstates are easy to hate, but at its best, the interstate is a new kind of creation. And I challenge anyone to drive through Glenwood Canyon, Colorado on Interstate 70 and not have a transcendent moment. Or southbound on I-295 as it rises over the Delaware Memorial Bridge and lifts you up out of the mire. Or on I-68 through the Sidling Hill Cut in Maryland, or even heading north on I-71 descending into the Ohio River Valley in Cincinnati. These are views, this feeling. This is the height of the highway engineer's art. They are of their time, to be sure, so one can hope that the highway of our time will do better.
All right, another interlude. So we have three essays about Florida. The one I mentioned earlier about Miami, and then one by Elias, which is about growing up an hour away from where Trayvon Martin was shot under the illegal regime there, which is a wonderful and devastating essay. And this is the third one, also very short, called Lehigh Acres Designated Place. It's by Spencer Fleury. I think when the end finally comes to America, it will look like Lehigh Acres. It never suffered a cataclysmic implosion like the one that broke Detroit. It has no grand urban ruins to serve as reminders of a great city that was. There is instead virgin space and frustration, weeds and snakes, and slowly crumbling tract homes. At 95 square miles, Lehigh Acres, Florida is a vast and largely empty preserve for the roughly 86,000 souls believed by the Census Bureau to live there. This is more space than is contained within the city limits of San Francisco or Boston or Miami. It is slightly smaller than Orlando or Tampa, two nearby cities with 3 and 4 times the population, respectively. Then again, Lehigh Acres may well be even bigger, or maybe smaller. We don't know for sure because there are no actual city limits for Lehigh Acres. It is categorized as a census-designated place, which seems to mean only that people agree it has a name. But is Lehigh Acres a place? I'm not entirely sure. It is freestanding sprawl. It cannot be a suburb in the literal sense of the word because it doesn't have an urb to be subordinate to. Nevertheless, even if it is not one, Lehigh Acres has the physical form of a standard-issue Florida suburb. Meandering streets converge at a single entry point to avoid giving access to those who don't belong. There are no sidewalks because there is nothing to walk to. Few, if any, old-growth trees because trees slow down the process of grafting row after row of identical stuccoed boxes onto the landscape. Deep front yards and generous setbacks keep company with expensive fences amid a lonely, indifferent quiet, broken only by a passing car or a far-off lawnmower, never by a human voice. In Lehigh Acres, the effect is amplified by the unintended empty spaces between homes. Unused lots have long since reverted back to nature, and much of the built environment is uninhabited. It is the only ghost town of 86,000 I've ever seen. To a geographer, place is something distinct from location. Events and processes define a place. Place includes location, but is not limited to it. It also signifies human influence and interaction. A single location can also be 2 different places on 2 different days, or even simultaneously. But location itself is immutable, and it seems that location is all there is in Lehigh Acres. With its enormous sky and broad stretches of wiregrass and scrub palmetto, southwest Florida has the look of a frontier. When the sun is high and the cicadas are whirring, it is a bright and lonely landscape. In the 1950s, ads for Lehigh Acres ran in northern newspapers promising a brand new home for only $10 down and $10 a month. The developers took the typical approach to infrastructure in Florida: grow fast and let the rest take care of itself, but applied it on an impossible scale. As a result, it is easy to drive through Lehigh Acres and not realize it. The emptiness sneaks up on you, uncoiling behind the generic trappings of Florida exurbia: scattered fast food outlets, a handful of newish shopping plazas with plastic banners rippling from the rooftops in place of permanent signs, the commercial plumage of transition or decline. Take a random right off Lee Boulevard, the main drag, and pull into almost any driveway. You will find an abandoned house surrounded by a chain-link fence and wheeled gate, which itself is padlocked shut and secured by a thick, rusty chain. Weeds and wild grasses infest the yard and wedge the driveway apart, reclaiming everything for the snakes. Some houses have plywood nailed over the windows, as if the owners were hunkered down inside, waiting to ride out the next storm with their plastic jugs of water and pyramids of canned beans and peaches. Often they are separated from each other by a stretch of empty lots, parcels that were plotted but never developed. If you drive around long enough, you may also stumble across one of the handfuls of gated communities, lonely outposts in an encroaching wilderness, their gates often mere yards away from blighted starter homes and lakes of wild grass. But those gates are porous. Beyond the guard shack, you might spot a patchy lawn or two, or faded green streaks of pollen caked onto someone's pastel yellow stucco, or a garage door that doesn't close properly. Lehigh Acres is not a place like Paris or Portland or Las Vegas or even Royal Oak, Michigan. It is not a neighborhood because this would require neighbors. There are no public spaces to speak of. Place implies the existence of something unique, something that a visitor can latch onto and say, "Ah, yes, you see, this is unmistakably Lehigh Acres." Yet no one could ever, will ever, say this. So the last reader tonight is Annie Wen, who is also a student here at Harvard and is writing a dissertation on comedy. I had really, I really wanted someone to write about Houston, because Houston is the 4th largest city in the country, really interesting oil economy, and so I no doubt Annie had some experience with Texas, and so I said, "Do you want to write about Houston?" And she said no. I don't. But I, I do want to write about Dallas. So this is anyway I'm on Dallas.
Thank you, Stephen. I have a soft voice, so it's good for me to check. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Great, okay. And I would also like to do a dorky thing and thank my parents, who are not here, but they told me that they were going to put this talk on the internet. So thanks, Mom and Dad. I really did want to write this essay. It's about the cities inside the city of Dallas where I grew up, and I wanted to write it very badly because I really didn't like growing up there. So we'll just leave it at that. Here we go. Perhaps there is something to be gained by first-hand knowledge of one of the Earth's truly bad places. Some wisdom and exposure to the dark heart of power. Unfortunately, I don't know what that is. Dallas is something I am ashamed of and frightened to share. I certainly felt ashamed when I lived there. My family didn't go to church, and we had less money than almost everybody, far less than the Hunt family, owners of Hunt Oil, $4 billion in revenue in 2013, or the Beecherls of Texas Oil and Gas, or the Westcotts or the Winns, who were real estate magnates. At Highland Park High School, which is where I went to school, there was alcohol and there was football, and every sport had a chaplain who led prayer beforehand. And anyone who didn't care about any of those three things, God, booze, touchdowns, was a leper. Weekly sports pep rallies were mandatory once the high school celebrated academic achievers by standing us in the middle of the gym while the varsity cheerleaders ran circles around us, shaking their pom-poms to outcasts. Hey, yeah. Yeah, it was bad. It cost $400,000 every year to put the 100-man varsity football team on the field. Our stadium was the second in the country to have AstroTurf, inside or outside the NFL. My friend Najib, the only Muslim I knew, used to faint during Ramadan when he'd practice with the rest of the defensive line without food and water. The average high in Dallas in July is 96 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to kill a big kid who runs for 2 hours without a sip of Gatorade. Najib would practice anyway. The team wouldn't let him start varsity if he didn't drill during his fast. It was near Christmas when the snow wasn't falling. On those rare occasions it did fall, it was paltry and bitter, the consistency of frozen ash, but the piles of wealth towered highest. On lawns around Jerry Jones's house on Preston Road, trees were wrapped in hundreds of thousands of bulbs, while Escalade-sized sleighs loaded with fake presents sported tags as big as street signs bearing the names of family members. There were gargantuan nativity displays, where baby Jesuses larger than spaniel dogs snuggled down in huge mangers. They knew, those Jesuses, that in Highland Park, luxury goods and low property taxes were God's reward for acting right. No matter which church you attended, HPUMC, PCPC, PCBC, Methodist, Presbyterian, Baptist, wealth was simply his way of persuading other people to become Christians too. It worked on my little brother for a while. He had a student Bible in a zip-around cover. We must resist, said my mother, we must resist the urge to throw it away. After 9/11, when I was in 9th grade, the Texas legislature imposed a moment of forced prayer at all public schools after we had said the Pledge of Allegiance and the Texas Pledge. The latter opens in an unnerving imperative: honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one and indivisible, and absence any mention of liberty and justice for all. I remember squirming and squirming. I knew enough about the Constitution to know what was happening was wrong, but the Constitution was far away. For children who didn't believe in the Christian God, this was the daily minute of humiliation at the hands of our own stubborn difference. I never asked Najib what he did during the minute, but I had another friend, Alex, who was a Belarusian immigrant and who went to the University of Texas after we left high school for a triple degree. Alex used to stand up at his desk during the moment of reflection and just talk about whatever was on his mind, because the moment of prayer was, according to him, total bullshit and against the separation of church and state and other things his family had moved to America to enjoy. I asked Alex once if his parents couldn't have found a less terrible place to live, and he frowned at me and explained that as an infant he had spent several months in a Soviet quarantine center because he had been exposed to Chernobyl radiation while out for a push in his stroller. I took his point, even if my own exposure to La Fiesta de las Seis Banderas felt just as poisonous. The fiesta was the culminating pageant of debutante season, a charity bash tracing the history of the state with 0 Hispanic people involved in it because anywhere from 0 to 3 Hispanic people went to our school. A selection mechanism I never understood, a rich mom cabal of some kind picked out 40 white high school women as Debs. These were the duchesses, each named after a city in Europe that might or might not have ever been part of a duchy. The dresses were great billowy confections, tiers of lace and shawls, and folding fans included. I read in the Park Cities People that the Duchess of the Confederacy got to wear the biggest dress, presumably because she was staring at the historical erasure of her nation by the Democrats and had to have a little more attitude than the other girls. I never went to a debutante ball, was never invited, and I'm still mad about it. Mine was a local weirdo family, and I wasn't at ease with women generally. I certainly couldn't have hung with the blonde girls long enough to provoke the necessary sympathy to be made sub-Duchess of Chenille sur Chanel. But I knew all about the dresses because beyond the pictures in the paper, each duchess had a doll made in her likeness, complete with a dress cut from the same fabric as the original. These were prominently displayed in the windows of the nicer shopping villages. These dolls sometimes had human hair cut from the real girls. As a test of my empathy, of the flexibility of my perspective, I sometimes try to imagine that I, too, am a woman who wants to be made into a doll. I could point to it and tell my granddaughters that once I was so beautiful that my people made of me this outrageous totem, a fetish of myself at peak value.
It is a happy book, also. It's not pure spleen. It's probably 85% spleen. Anyway, so questions? People have questions?
Did your group discuss at all the juggernaut of the Olympics that kind of lays a blight on some American cities, and especially now Boston? It seems like our public discourse has been captured by should we or should not in 2024. I think it'd make a nice sequel to your project on the history of Olympics in American cities, and maybe even the world.
Yeah. I mean, do you want to speak to?
I just think that's a great idea, and I don't know if it hasn't been done yet, why we're not doing it. I think it's always the promise. It's going to turn the city around, and our friend Mitt did Utah and turned it into something special, and Boston's going to do the same thing.
Higher income residences driving out.
Absolutely. I lived in London, and they were bringing it, and everyone was excited. I remember right before we were moving to London, hearing they won the Olympics and going, damn, that's going to really mess things up. And it seems to be the story. They build infrastructure. It's good, but it's often not used. So I think it's a very interesting idea.
Yeah, I think it was in one of the announcements for this program that it invoked the both Hunter S. Thompson as well as that classic WPA series, right? So wondering what other influences kind of got you guys to conceptualize this book, and how you wanted it to be sort of positioned in the kind of urban commentary about different cities.
Yes, that's I love my publishers. That copy is written by FSG, actually.
Really?
Yeah,
Okay.
and
Don't
so
run away from it.
no, I'm not. I mean, I like Hunter S. Thompson, and so I think a lot of influences. I think the WPA guides especially, but I think that what's interesting about the city at this contemporary moment is that people of our generation are really moving back in droves, and it doesn't look like we're going to leave in quite the same way that the previous generations did. And so I think this was intended to be a sort of document of a sort of newer generation moving back to the city and what we found there.
This is like a millennial voice kind of thing?
Ooh, yes, sure, we could do that. Yeah.
You can send that to your publisher.
No, you don't want to do that? Okay, all right, no, all right.
There it is.
Yeah.
I come from the Minneapolis area. Duluth? There's more material. When are you going to do volume 2?
Yes, hopefully soon, because we have a number of Duluth, certainly, St. Louis, Salt Lake City, lots of places. Actually, we do have a Duluth in the book, but it is Duluth, Georgia, which fooled me actually when I was for a while. But yeah, so hopefully there'll be another volume at some point.
Well, that would be a theme, you know. Duluth, Georgia.
There you go.
Rome, New York.
Yes, yeah. Counterintuitive city names, yeah.
Do you know where we get the word city?
Do you know that?
Is it like situate, sit down, cite?
Yeah.
Just this, it's from Latin.
Yeah, just say it's from Latin, no one will know.
Greg says it's from the Latin. I think he's right. Civitas, which goes into the Roman città, comes cite in French. Yes.
They're better grad students than me.
Great rest.
Other questions? Yeah.
Do you guys have any examples of successful cities or happy cities?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the one of my favorite things in the book is an interview with a sort of economist named Garl Perovitz, who talks a lot about what's going on in Cleveland right now. Because Cleveland got so bad that there was an opportunity to really rethink of how city politics wanted to work. And so what they figured out was that what was important was what they call democratizing capital, which means that making sure that everyone who's working at an institution has a share in the growth that happens. Not just that they sort of get a better wage or that they have better conditions, although those are important too, but that if you're working at a business, as the value of that business appreciates, everyone has an investment in the appreciation of that business. And so what they've done is they've looked at Cleveland and they said, okay, we have the Mayo Clinic, we have Case Western, we have all these institutions that cannot move, right? They can't get up and leave if the sort of situation changes. And those, for example, the hospitals spend something like $30 million a year on laundry. So why don't we build one of these cooperatives that focuses on laundry that will service these anchor institutions? And the people working at the laundry will have a stake in that business. And because those anchor institutions aren't going to go anywhere, we can actually build a much more sort of sustainable kind of urban community out of these sort of local circuits of consumption, which I think is a great idea, and I'd never heard of it before. So I think there are some examples. Even Syracuse, which is a sort of depressing essay, ends on a sort of up note. So I definitely think there's positive stuff. Should we end there? Other questions? Awesome. Thank you guys so much for coming.